Thank you very much. I too am delighted to be here today, and I think you'll find that there are certain common messages that I'm going to put across which very much reflect some of the things that Mark has been saying. What I would like to do today is to talk over the next half hour about the regulation of undergraduate medical education in the United Kingdom, and I would plan to do that by talking in a number of themes. I'm going to say just a few words about the general role of the GMC. I'll spend most of my time talking about how we set and assure educational standards. I'll talk a bit about the link to GMC registration, some of the things that we're currently doing in educational standards, and say a little bit at the end about some of the issues I think that are thrown up by the interaction between professional bodies and higher education. So, the GMC has been around for 150 years. It was founded as the General Council for Medical Education and Registration, interestingly, and its role is to both protect and improve the health and safety of patients and the public, and it's to do that by ensuring appropriate standards of medicine. And we do that by really having four main functions. The first is we have a register of all doctors. We also hold a register of specialists and of general practitioners. We have our education function, which I'll talk about. We set professional and ethical standards. Good medical practice was mentioned, and that's our core guidance to all doctors. There's a series of other documents that we produce. And then we also have fitness to practice procedures for doctors who are accused of breaching those professional and ethical standards. Until 3 years ago, the GMC had responsibility only for undergraduate medical education and the first year after graduation. However, since then we have assumed responsibility for all areas of medical education. So we're now responsible for undergraduate education, for postgraduate education and training, and also for CPD, and for the linked issue of revalidation, which is the 5-yearly cycle by which doctors will have to renew their licence. That came into existence at the end of last year. We achieve these purposes by setting educational standards in each of these areas and assuring that they're being delivered. Our approach differs a bit at undergraduate and at postgraduate level. At undergraduate level, we are very much outcomes driven, whereas at postgraduate level, we're much more curriculum specification driven. And I'm really only going to talk about the undergraduate component, although in discussion I'm happy to talk about the postgraduate. We believe that the standards we need to set for medical schools and for postgraduate trainers need to be challenging and demanding, but they also need to be realistic. So we have a very consultative approach to developing our standards. So when we are developing standards, we'll talk to patients and the public, we'll talk to the educators, we'll talk to the professions, not just medicine, we'll talk to students, we'll talk to the employers, and we'll offer a draft series of standards out for public consultation, which will then be reviewed in the light of these comments that we get back. Our core document for undergraduate medical education is called Tomorrow's Doctors. It was first published in 1993 and I think has been revolutionary in changing undergraduate medical education in the United Kingdom. Within that, there are a key series of themes which have continued since 1993. The first is that we moved to integrated curricula. So we required medical schools to remove specific disciplines as modes of teaching and to approach by an organs or a systems base. So when they're learning about the heart, they will learn about the biochemistry and the physiology and so on together rather than separately. Also within Tomorrow's Doctors as part of the integrated curriculum is much more emphasis on the humanities in medicine than has there been in previous areas. We have a requirement for medical schools to have early clinical experience, and we will now expect medical students to start meeting patients from year 1 rather than from year 3 or 4, as was the case previously. We have much more of an increased emphasis on the practical skills that we expect doctors to have, and also on the softer professional skills that we would expect them to have. And a theme that's come up already, we also require the reduction of factual burden. For about 100 years, the GMC had been saying to medical schools, there's far too much information in your curricula. And for about 100 years, medical schools were ignoring the GMC. In 1993, the GMC, and if you don't do it, we're going to stop registering medical schools. That got attention, and as a result, the curricula have substantially reduced in factual burden. By looking at what do they really need to know, But also, just as importantly, are there things that you actually don't want the student to try to remember? Are there key things that are so important you want them to look it up rather than try to remember? And that's back to the open book issue that Mark was talking about a few minutes ago. Within Tomorrow's Doctors, what we do is we set outcomes for all undergraduate students, outcomes that we expect all students to have attained, and we also set a series of standards for delivery by the medical schools. We don't, however, set any curricular type. And if you look around the 31 medical schools in the UK, you'll see a wide variety of curricular approaches. Some are really quite didactic and more traditional. Others are much more small group, problem-based learning, and so on. We also don't have any requirements around the sequence in which particular bits of material appear. Now that's great because that, we believe, allows medical schools to innovate and to experiment with how they deliver material. But it is a problem. It makes it extremely difficult for a student to transfer from one medical school to another. And it's actually reduced the amount of mobility that medical students now have around medical schools. We assure the outcomes by a process that I'll talk about in a few minutes. But the basic assumption we have, of course, is that the undergraduate degree in medicine is only preparing graduates for later education and training, and that no doctor will be going out into professional practice, an independent practice rather, without very substantial subsequent training. And that, of course, then allows you to constrain what you have within your undergraduate curriculum. Here's our overarching outcome within Tomorrow's Doctors. We say that graduates have to make the care of patients their first concern. And obviously 2 weeks after the Mid-Staffordshire report, that's a pretty important message to be getting across to our graduates. They need to apply their knowledge, their skills, and they need to apply their professional softer skills, the practical and ethical approaches. And they also need to recognise that they often will be acting in situations that are quite complex and have a degree of uncertainty associated with it. It may not be absolutely clear what's wrong with the patient. You may not have all of the results before you're taking action in emergency situations and so on. The outcomes more specifically, we arrange around 3 areas. There's the doctor as the scholar and the scientist, and that's the knowledge bit. There's a doctor as the practitioner, and that's things like being able to examine a patient, being able to communicate with a patient. And the doctor as a professional, that's the ethical and professional and softer values such as team working. One of my colleagues sometimes refers these to the head, the hand and the heart as the bits of what you want the individual to know. We also, at the end of Tomorrow's Doctor, have an appendix of 32 practical procedures that we expect every graduate to be competent in at the point of graduation. And some of them are diagnostic, for example, being able to take blood. Some of them are therapeutic, being able to give an injection. And some of them are general hygiene or safe moving and handling of a patient. We have the outcome structured, of course, in these 3 areas, but they aren't silos, and there's great interaction, of course, between them. What we do require, however, is that when a student is being assessed, they are shown to be competent at each of these domains, and they cannot cross-compensate in these domains. We have 9 domains, and I won't go into them all in detail, that we set for medical schools. Patient safety is there right at the top, partly getting students to think about patient safety, but also making sure that patients are safe while students are given access to them. We talk about equality, diversity and opportunity. So that's just not just equality and diversity and opportunity for students and for the staff, but also the implications that that has for how students will deal with patients who are coming from a wide variety of backgrounds. And we know that individuals from a different background, from a different cultural background, may have an entirely different belief about disease and a different response to disease, and students need to be able to understand that. We have some standards around student selection. Selection of individual students is up to the medical schools and the universities, but we have a requirement that their processes are seen to be transparent and fair. We also have a requirement that they select students who only are able potentially to practice medicine. So they're able both to complete the undergraduate course and complete some course of postgraduate training. And the reason we have that is because in medicine, the numbers are strictly controlled. And we therefore believe it's important that, given the oversupply we have of applicants, that we're letting students study medicine who are able eventually to practice medicine, all being well. We require schools to have structures around how they design, deliver, and review their curriculum, but also around their assessment processes. And around assessment processes, we have requirements such as standard setting and blueprinting and so on. We have further standards around how students can be supported in a pastoral sense, but also how staff can be developed within their roles. We talk about the management structures that we expect schools to have, the fact that they have to have enough educational resources for the number of students that they're teaching, and also we want them to show us how they're going to demonstrate that their graduates have actually met our outcomes. So those are the standards that we apply to the medical schools. We produced the most recent edition of Tomorrow's Doctors in 2009, and then was a 2-year period of implementation, because the jump from the previous edition of Tomorrow's Doctors was quite substantial, and we felt it would take medical schools a year or two to become ready to deliver it. So it became live in academic year 2011-2012. But during that interim period, we had a collaborative process between the GMC and individual schools, but also between the various schools themselves. What we required from each school on a fairly regular basis was an update of the progress that they were making towards the new standards, and were there areas in which they were encountering difficulty. On the basis of that, we provided feedback to the schools as to how they might counter some of the difficulties that they had. But also, if we knew there was another school that was actually doing well what they were finding difficult, we put them in touch with that other school. We also, over that period, ran a series of workshops for medical schools, but also for other people such as the postgraduate trainers and the employers, and also patients and public, to see if there were any systemic difficulties across medical schools that would make the sorts of standards that we were trying to introduce difficult, or were there areas in which we'd said something that wasn't absolutely clear in Tomorrow's Doctors or needed a bit more teasing out. And as a result of that process, we then produced a further series of 4 pieces of guidance. One around the assessment approaches that we would expect the medical schools to have, not specifying specific assessments in specific areas, but talking about what are the principles of good assessment and offering some good examples that we knew medical schools were already doing. We produced some more guidance on clinical placements, because a large part, obviously, in medical education is actually on clinical placement in the wards or in the general practitioner surgery. And in particular, we offered guidance on something called a student assistantship, which we expect students to undertake now towards the end of their course, where they effectively are acting as an apprentice to the junior doctor. We produced extra guidance on developing teachers and trainers, and also guidance on how we would expect medical schools to show that they're involving the public and the patients in medical education. And you can find those extra pieces of guidance at the web address shown at the bottom of that slide. One of the things that we have as a requirement for medical schools is that they have to have fitness to practice procedures. And that's a requirement that if they have a student who they believe is exhibiting behaviours that are so serious that it throws into doubt whether they are likely to be safe as a doctor, then the school must take action. And at the extreme end, they may actually terminate the student's studies on that ground alone, independent of any academic ground. So we have a requirement that schools have this, and we've used some guidance jointly in 2009 with the Medical Schools Council, which is the alliance of the 31 medical schools. In the first half of that, we are addressing the students, and we develop in considerably more detail the professional attributes that we've outlined in the Tomorrow's Doctors 2009, but we go into them in much more detail with many more examples for the students. And in the second half of the document, we set out the various standards that we expect schools to have. Now, these are standards that are generic, because one of the things where we run up against here is, of course, different institutions will have quite different regulations themselves and will have quite different ways of doing things. So instead of saying there is a specific way in which it must be done, what we do is we say there are various standards that we expect your regulations will be able to adjust and work within your regulations. Our assuring standards is done really in a variety of ways and has 4 elements to it. The first is that we approve against the standards and the outcomes that I've already talked about. The second thing is that we look only at shared evidence, so there's no secret evidence that is used in assessing an institution. And if, for example, there is evidence that we have that is critical or is difficult for a school, we will share that with them and look for their response. We have a series of visits, and we also have a mechanism if concerns are raised about a particular medical school, about responding to that either by correspondence or by an extra visit if required. The sorts of evidence that we use is we have an annual report from all medical schools. Now, some of that is demographic, but we also expect them to tell us of any subcurricular changes that they're making. And also each year we will ask all schools to give us a report on a particular aspect. So we looked at things like assessment and selection and so on. We have visits to the medical schools, roughly every 5 years or twice in 10 years, I think, as our regulations say. We're looking at whether the cyclical approach is actually the best approach, and I'll touch on that in a moment. And then we use all other sources of information that come our way. So we get correspondence from students or from doctors or teaching medical students or patients who've come across students from a particular medical school. We have a range of regional liaison officers across the UK who are very much interacting with both the employers and with the medical schools on their patch, and we will use intelligence from them. We'll use reports from other regulators. So again, for example, when the Care Quality Commission first raised issues about Mid Staffordshire in 2009, one of the things we did was to talk to Keele Medical School, which had medical students there, to make sure that they were taking action. In fact, they were behaving impeccably. They were actually doing what they should have done, but we would take action in that sort of circumstance. The outcomes, we can have unconditional approval, and that doesn't have a time limit because it's until the next inspection, which of course is not absolutely defined. We can have approval with requirements for change, and if there are requirements for change, we will set a timescale for that. If requirements for change are put in place, then that will usually require a follow-up response from the school and probably require a further visit to make sure that the issues have actually been dealt with. And then there's a possibility of withdrawal of recognition. Now, we haven't done that to any university courses recently, but some 10 years ago we withdrew recognition of various licentiate approaches that some of the medical Royal Colleges were running. And 2 years ago, Swansea Medical School were introducing a new medical curriculum. They were having problems in organising their year 3. We said to them we thought they were not ready for year 3, and so their cohort of students who were about to enter year 3 were transferred to Cardiff, and their year 3 introduction was delayed by a year. So we will take action if we feel there are problems in the standards. What do we do with this QA evidence? Well, we report it on the public GMC website, so it's available for anyone to see. And within that, we have an account of the findings set against the standards. We set out the requirements that we've got for change and the timescales. We have another set of recommendations for change. These are the ones that we think might be a good idea, but we're not absolutely going to hold the school to them in the same way as we would with a requirement. And then we highlight any areas of good practice that we've found within the school. And we publish that along with the response of the school to the report, which is usually the action plan that they have for dealing with the requirements that we've set up. Talk a little bit about registration for a minute or two. Any doctor who wants to practice clinically in the UK, whether within the NHS or in private practice, has to hold GMC registration and also a licence to practice. Now, we have two forms of registration. The first, provisional registration, is what students get when they graduate. So they have that immediately after graduation, and that allows them to work in posts that are fairly heavily supervised. Used to be called the GHO or resident post, now called Foundation Year 1. And they work in very heavily regulated and approved posts. And if they successfully complete the outcomes for FY1, and they are written down as part of our postgraduate requirements, then they're granted full registration with the GMC, which allows them much greater freedom of practice. To get provisional registration, a UK graduate, first of all, has to have a degree from one of the recognised 31 medical schools, but also since 2008, they now have to complete a fitness to practice declaration to say that they believe there is or is not an issue that they need to raise for us to consider before we grant them registration. Since 2008, we've, as you can see on this slide, we have registered some 35,000 medical students. About 10% of them declare an issue that they think needs to be considered. Some issue that's arisen in terms of discipline at medical school or a health issue that they might have. About half of those we judge to be of no significance, but about half of them actually do require some further investigation. Most of them are dismissed as not being required, but over the last 5 years we have actually refused registration to 10 students who have graduated from UK medical schools because of concerns about fitness to practice. What things we're currently doing? Well, we're currently reviewing whether our new Tomorrow's Doctors actually has made any difference, and in particular we've started to look at whether the curricula and the assessments that medical schools carry out have altered to meet the new outcomes and the standards. We have some work done previously about how well prepared or unprepared graduates are for starting practice on day one of Foundation Year 1. And we're going to look at whether our new Tomorrow's Doctor standards have made them better prepared than they were previously. We believe they should have, because things like practical procedures and so on, we have much more addressed in the most recent edition. And also we want to look at whether the changes in standards and outcomes have had any impact on equality and diversity matters within the medical profession. Some of you may know that Alan Milburn, when he talked about widening participation last year, had some pretty harsh things to say about the medical profession. And of the professions, we probably are the one that has been least successful in including individuals who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. We have a pretty good record in terms of ethnic minorities, but we have a much less good record on individuals who come from non-traditional backgrounds. And that's something I think we do need to continue to work on. Over the last couple of years, we've been looking at our quality assurance methods, and in particular over the last 2 years, we've been looking simultaneously at undergraduate education and postgraduate training in a geographical area. That became possible when we gained responsibility for postgraduate education some 3 years ago. So in the first year, 2011-2012, we looked at the medical schools and the postgraduate deaneries in Wales and the West Midlands, and this year we're looking at those in London. And what we do is we have parts of the process that are common between undergraduate and postgraduate activities. So a lot of the interaction, for example, with the NHS can be a single interaction rather than a separate undergraduate and postgraduate interaction. But we also have separate bits that dig into particular aspects that are specific to either undergraduate or postgraduate requirements. As a result, we produce individual reports for the medical schools and for the postgraduate deanery, but we also produce a regional report which looks across the education and training of that particular part of the country. And we've found that to actually be much more powerful and give us much richer information than if reporting on individual schools. And also we find it's taken much more seriously by the educational and health authorities. If there's a problem across a region, it's much more difficult for a trust or for a strategic health authority to say, oh, that's just that medical school or that's deanery. If it's across the patch, it's much more likely to come to their attention. And we're finding it is a useful tool to have in our approach. The other thing we've been doing in terms of our QA methods is we're currently reviewing our overall approach. And last year, we commissioned a report into the international approach to the regulation of healthcare education of various sorts, and that's available on the GMC website at that web address. And the sorts of things that we found from that were, first of all, it was an almost universal framework of having standards and criteria, that self-assessment by the institution was very important, and then external validation of that self-assessment being carried out. And finally, that public reporting of the outcome was very common. We also found within that emphasis was shifting to enhancing quality rather than just accountability and a tick box of saying a standard is met. That rather than having a cyclical approach of saying we visit every 3 years or 5 years or whatever, a risk-based targeting was perhaps more appropriate. So that if, for example, you have a medical school that is consistently performing well, it gets a degree of earned autonomy from regulation. Whereas if it's a school that's not performing well, then actually you come to, not every 5 years, but perhaps every 2 years or whatever. Interesting that when we tested that with the medical schools, many of them said, actually, even if we were a well-performing school, we'd still want you to be coming round to give us external validation. So an interesting response that I think we hadn't predicted. And the other thing internationally is something that we've been trying to do is moving much more towards standards which focus on the graduate outcomes rather than the processes occurring within the medical school. The processes are important and you have to be sure that they are working properly, but it's really the graduate outcomes that are the most important. And the final finding was that transparency throughout the process and transparency of reporting was something that really promoted effective quality assurance. We've also now, because we've got responsibility for the whole swathe of medical education, looking at the continuum. So are there generic outcomes that should actually be there across the whole continuum from day one at medical school till you retire from clinical practice? And when we rewrote Good Medical Practice, our core guidance recently, in addition to changing the content, we changed the format so that it became easier to use it as a framework for developing educational outcomes. We also want to make sure that outcomes are integrated across the curriculum, and so there's an appropriate progression as people move up the continuum. But also paying particular attention around transition phases, because we know the times when doctors get into trouble most often are when they transition from one status to another. So they move from being a student to being a new doctor. They move from being a foundation practitioner to a specialist practitioner. They move from being a specialist trainee to being a consultant. And what can we do educationally to support doctors and students at these times? We've been evaluating selection methods for the medical schools jointly with the Medical Schools Council, looking both at the academic criteria that we set and the various non-cognitive approaches that we have in selecting medical students. A big issue has been to what extent can you make reasonable adjustments for students who have a disability or who have a health problem, so that they're still able to meet the outcomes. Because we don't think you can change the outcomes to the patient who's seeing the doctor. It doesn't matter that they've got a disability, you still have to be able to deliver the outcome. So to what extent can you make reasonable adjustments and still allow students to achieve the outcomes, both at undergraduate and at postgraduate level? And finally, we've, over the last year, developed a process of recognition of teachers and trainers at undergraduate level. And we have a requirement now for schools that for individuals in key posts in medical schools who are medically qualified, they will have to have gone through a recognition process by 2015. And if schools are not able to demonstrate that they have these individuals who are appropriately trained to occupy these roles, then of course we'll be asking questions of them. So, just to finish, what are some of the issues around the interaction between professional bodies and higher education? I think the first one is, does professional education actually have to be in a HEI? From time to time people will say to me, we should just train doctors in the NHS, just train medical students in the NHS. And I think that would be a disaster for all sorts of reasons. But I think there is real value in having professional education within a multi-faculty HEI. I think when we're talking about professional degrees, particularly one like medicine where practice starts without any further educational intervention after graduation, you need to remember this is a passport to a profession. So that does have implications for selection. I've touched on some of those. I think it does mean you have to have outcomes that at least partly are defined by the professional body. I think there's an interesting tension sometimes between what is the balance between general education and specific training for the immediate post-graduation role. And I think actually one of the roles of the regulators is to stop too much of the training and ensure there's enough of the education. There's the importance, as I've talked about, of professional behaviours, and that sometimes can be difficult for HEIs because these students are then being held to a different standard from a student who's not on a professional course. And what's the link between graduation and registration within the profession? And I've talked about that. I think there's a role for the professional bodies in making sure they're encouraging innovation, or at least not putting barriers in the way of that. There's an interesting relationship between the HEIs and the regulator, and to what extent the outcomes and standards that the regulator sets inhibits the HEI or cuts across its regulatory requirements and regulations of their own. What should be the relationship between the students and the regulator? Over the last year, we've looked again at the question of whether the GMC should register medical students. We decided not to, but we do believe it's actually very important that we are establishing contact with students at an early stage. And then finally, and one that we're really bad at, how do we avoid duplication of QA processes within the professional regulator and bodies such as QAA? Thanks very much.
Thank you.